Welcome back, everybody. Because we got you off schedule, I'm now going to rush us into getting back on schedule, or at least to keep the pace. Parts of me wonders if we, the hosts and moderators, needed that brass bell from last night to keep ourselves on track. We won't ring it, but we'll just move straight on ahead into the second session, which will be moderated by Richard Rhodes, called Infrastructure, Reinventing Institutions. So please welcome Rick Rhodes.
Thank you, Christine. The next time I see my counselor, I'm going to suggest the City of Toronto has an official blanket. Anyway, good afternoon. We're here to talk about institutions for the next hour. And what strikes me about Christine's phrasing of this second conversation is the unalloyed optimism about the role of institutions in contemporary art. That optimism, I think, might go back to an evening last winter when we watched Jean de Loisy of the Palais de Tokyo step off a plane from Paris and deliver an inspiring 2-hour lecture at the power plant that broached his plans for programming at the Palais, but maybe more importantly, expressed a bureaucratic-free vision of how exhibitions and exhibition venues can be creative partners in the reception and interpretation of art. Innovation would be a one-word summary of his theme that night, and innovation is the word that ends the description of this conversation in our brochure. It's the word that I now pass over to our panelists. Having no skills as a blogger, I will just call out your names in turn, and we'll go from there. Next time we do this, though, my suggestion would be is that we put you not in alphabetical order, but in order of operating budgets. So, and it,
I don't want to go last. I don't want to go last.
No, I know this would be a contentious issue.
The littlest one.
In any event, let's start with Barbara. Barbara Fischer, Justina M, Barnicke Gallery at U of T.
Thanks, and thanks to everyone for organizing this. Does this work, the microphone? Okay.
You have to hit the
yellow button.
I have to hit the mic. Good point. Thanks very much, and thanks so much for the organization of this symposium. I prefer to sit down here. I just feel it's more of a conversation that way because, well, maybe that's just an excuse because my level of preparation for this is not super.
Oh, come on, it will be.
I wanted to start just briefly. Toronto and Ontario are Iroquois names, and we are on Mississauga territory, who are part of the Ojibwe or else named Anishinaabe Nation. I saw this introduction being done by Srimori Mitra, who is now at the Art Gallery of Windsor, and I thought it was an important intervention, something that doesn't happen so much in Ontario or in Toronto yet, but is the practice really in British Columbia in major ways. And I thought it would be, since she introduced it, I'm just copying Sri Moya and want to recognize her in this. I also wanted to start this by saying that I'm not going to talk about my institution, in part because we are currently in transition, and in some ways I've been at the Justina Barnicke Gallery for about 7.5 years now. It's kind of a chapter that is, in a sense, possibly coming to a close, and there's a beginning of a new chapter about which I can't say anything yet, really. It's too early to reflect, and it's too early to be prognostic. I'm very thrilled to be kind of in a state of rethinking, reimagining, imagining something new, and what that means institutionally is just not really possible to talk about at the moment. So to the topic of the panel, the question of reinventing institutions, and more specifically to the subject that the panel introduction broaches, as the last decade, having seen the evolution of institutions in Paris and Toronto that enabled the development of new practices, networks, and collaborations, and moving beyond national or localized mandates of the traditional contemporary art museum or art school, and instead to encourage the accumulation of knowledge through shared concerns based on experience and practice. This being the introduction to the panel today, the first thought for me was, and I find that I have this sort of a recurrent refrain in my brain. Maybe it is because I'm situated in a university, in a curatorial studies program, in art history and so on. For me is, what exactly is new? What are the new practices, the new networks and collaborations? And while I believe strongly that there will be propositions on that, my instinct was to start to think, okay, how do you measure this new? How do you think about what is distinct from a past moment? What is different now, a decade later? Did we say what happened before this last decade, as the panel introduction stipulates? And so for me, the problem with this question is that the referent for the decade is sort of missing still. It may be just my problem. Are we talking about Generation Y versus Generation X? Not enough, in my opinion, is said about the old or about the past. And can one say new in Toronto? In what way then? And it was, for me, actually, interesting to have been able to see the Paris Triennial that was organized by Océan Resort 2012, Intense Proximities, because it was really a very moving, very important exhibition, and using the megaform of the biennial, but to really do something quite different, which was to plummet local history, local in the sense of looking back at 19th century formations of anthropology, of culture, definitions of culture, Levi-Strauss and so on, and situating contemporary works from the peripheries and the former colonies in particular to try to begin to understand what actually it might mean to be either in a globalized world, but from a specifically decolonial or post-colonial perspective. And to me, while sometimes I've heard my colleagues in Paris say that Paris is in a sense behind in some of these discourses, I actually feel that in Toronto we are behind in that regard. However, I think what distinguishes Toronto, Canada also to a large degree, but Toronto in particular, and that kind of ties back to the questions we were dealing with yesterday, is that Toronto is extremely good at microecology. Ecology, Toronto is an ecology, and in the sense of community embraces questions of ecology, where the term, it's a kind of ecology is biology, in a sense. Andrew Hunter talked about that a little bit, about that. A community is a group of interacting living organisms sharing a populated environment, and the way in which the Toronto art scene has developed in this ecology is really not as a scene, but a kind of constant multiplication of specific groupings, regrouping, countering, really being kind of an experiment in motion of something that Melanie Bouteloup mentioned yesterday, this model that Chantal Mouffe elaborated as community, or rather as a democracy being a kind of experiment in motion where adversaries emerge, counter each other's positions, push each other forward, hopefully, and then lead to regroupings, multiplications, and kind of rhizomatic organizations. I think Toronto is an incredible ecology with that kind of specificity, in my opinion. That's how I experience Toronto, and I think it has been said many times. So it's it has an incredible energetic history of microecologies. Sometimes that's kind of manifests itself even in terms of neighborhoods, but it is particularly visible at the development of institutions. And at the risk of being extremely generic and terribly, probably inaccurate, I would like to just sort of mention by decade what I kind of see maybe some of the developments that are not yet captured. We do not actually even have a chronology. There was a fabulous book for our guests, really important book, From Sea to Shining Sea, published at the Power Plant in 1987, which tried to trace made a chronology. Peggy Gale was involved, made a chronology of artist-initiated activities in the country. And many cities have since then developed their own chronologies and texts and histories. But as I've said many times, and I share that a lot with Louis Jacob, we tend to say this a lot, Toronto doesn't have that kind of narrative in a sense. If it is captured here, there's not really specifically a recent one. There are, however, moments, ecologic moments to capture certain moments. So if one talks about the idea of what is new now, I think in Toronto we need to kind of figure out what exactly were the news and how did they emerge. And I think looking at the artist-run and artist-initiated activities, there's an interesting trajectory. I think A-Space, which started in 1970, 71, itself a kind of regrouping of another preceding center, was not initially called A-Space, but rather a space. The A was actually lower cap. It became A-Space eventually. It evolved into an institution that people knew as A-Space, losing the sense of a space. But that was really, I think, significant because I think at that time artists wanted to bring about a new space, a new sense of space, installation practices, performances, immaterial practices, the ability to do something that was not institutionalized practice of art as it existed in the surrounding context. And so I think that was really critical. Installation was born there in a sense, and interactive participatory forums, performance, video, and so on. And what is important about that moment is that it stood at the beginning, and was the germinating factor of it was that it tried to bring about a new concept of art, a new way of thinking about what art was in relation to its world. We shouldn't think of institutional history as the history of institutions, but rather as mobilized, by different concepts of art, by urgencies of changing art in relation to urgencies that appear in the world every day differently, new in some ways. With certain trajectories underlying that. And video as a medium emerged at that time, a narcissistic medium. It was in part to capture what was there by mirroring it. And I mentioned that briefly, and the critical role of general idea in that. In the late 1970s, there was in Toronto a rupture of that model, which this sort of narcissism of the medium, the idea of wanting simply to exist, that's not simply, that's wrong to say that, but to exist and to do that through media began to actually lead, on the one hand, A-Space had by then, a space had become A-Space, and a young generation reacted against the institutionalization of A-Space, seeing themselves not reflected there, and also with different concerns in mind, started to react, and it was exactly that adversarial moment that Chantal Mouffe discusses as critical. Adversarial, there were coups in existing spaces, and a proliferation of a whole host of new artist-run centers, YYZ, Mercer Union, Public Access, Gallery 44, Cold City Gallery, WARC, Women's Art Resource Center, and much more centered around the ideas of representation, language and representation, that is no longer to bring into existence, but to be critical of representation and what representation ultimately entails. That is part of the institutional question, but also the questions of art, and they drive each other. And I'm being very general, and really, I'm trying to sort of race through this. At the end of the 1980s, there was a sense also that at that point in Canada, the artist-run centers had proliferated from one in 1969 or 70 to 46, it was clear that Canada Council could no longer simply sustain a further proliferation. Funding models changed, supporting instead collective activities, so project-based collectives. Andy Fabo wrote a really wonderful article in Parallelogram at the end of its existence, actually, towards the end of existence, where in The Way of the Maverick, he described, and this is interesting because it is an economic way of introducing it, everyone was clinging to their own rafts in the sea of uncertainty, and it's sort of an adequate description. There was, on the one hand, a retraction to ideas of art as art, site specificity, art retracting into mediums. For instance, painting disorders was heavily focused on specifically painting practices, but also a new proliferation of artist centers or artist activities based on cultural difference and cultural diversity. So it's kind of, again, this moment of rhizomatic activity at the end of this 80s. Yes, and throughout the 90s. A huge rupture of what tended to coexist in Toronto then. Collectives, artist-run centers, artist-initiated activities centered in existing spaces came in 2000, around the time also of SARS in 2003, and all of a sudden, very quickly, and I think in an unprecedented way, the emergence of megaforms. The SARS crisis produced this kind of Rolling Stones effect, bringing in massive international brands to recover for tourism what Toronto seemed to have lost, but on the other hand, also what Pierre Teberge in 2006 called all of a sudden a sense that Toronto was at the cusp of a renaissance with billions of dollars spent on mega initiatives such as the revitalization and rebuilding of the ROM, the Art Gallery of Ontario, the sort of burgeoning of TIFF and so on. And in 2008, a creative city planning document. How much time do I have? Am I okay? Well, I'm okay.
No, you're okay.
I'm okay. Yeah. For instance, generated out of, in this context, 2008 Creative City Planning document, a supporting document to the Agenda for Prosperity. It begins by saying, this is a prospectus for a great city in 2008, and it comes out of two moments. The mayors, at the time David Miller, vision of creativity as an economic engine, and Richard Florida's arrival in Toronto, specifically at the University of Toronto, two prominent indications of the importance of creativity at this moment in the city's history. The planning document goes on to say, Toronto is riding an unprecedented wave of creative and cultural successes at every scale. Major, new, and expanded facilities, ROM, AGO, Royal Conservatory Music, National Ballet School, Gardner Museum, Ontario College of Arts, designed by world-renowned architects. The extraordinary success of Limonado, a major new festival created through private sector vision and leadership, the Toronto International Festival, the largest and many argue most influential festival, etc. It was kind of this weird burgeoning sense of that Toronto had exploded into megaforms. And so if we think that that is the last decade, then for me the question is, what now? And I think there is a persistence of the importance of microecologies and artist-initiated activities, and how do they stand and or work and operate in relation to these megaforms? I think that there's been some really interesting work to come out of Nuit Blanche, and thank you to our Paris guests for Nuit Blanche, that after all is an import from Paris. There's been some interesting work, I think, in relation to art as a megaform. Nuit Blanche is a ground for that, a testing ground. And I guess maybe that's where I'm going to end. That to me is the question, that if that is this past decade of this that has been shaped and by which the city has been shaped, what are the new urgencies at the ecological level? I'm going to stop now.
Thank you, Barbara. Nicely done. Not a chance I would interrupt such an elegant synopsis of 4 decades. So, but I do want to remind everybody on this panel that we have 1 hour. So if we go over, we're taking time for questions, which might in fact be an institutional conspiracy. So anyway, over to you, Vincent Honoré.
Hello.
Just arrow through. If you just, that'll move to you.
Okay. Yep. I run a private institution in London, and this is why I will speak about public institutions in Paris. So my French colleagues, you can go and have a coffee, you know already everything. And when asked to think about why we should reinvent the institution, the first question is, why? Do they need to be reinvented in a way? Well, with her 2008 intervention at the ICA London, titled Resisting Institutionalization, you want to read it? Because I can't pronounce this word. British curator Emily Pethick, the current director of the showroom in London, can help us to understand better what negative connotation an institution can have or could have. As opposed to a dialogic, flexible, and polyphonic art organization, the institution, and often by extension its director, represents the authoritative and self-referential structure. By institution, we often refer to the Western modern of the traditional museum. By institution, we often mean fixed representation. However, globalization and the consequent general cultural shift in recent years allowed, if not forced, to accept polyphony and to reconsider all linear and hegemonic art histories. I work days and nights on this paper, so I'm sorry to read it, but... Institutions, as wrote Kathy Halbrecht, the associate director of the MoMA in New York, now speak in terms of multiplicity, making more complex to understand who are the authors in the construction of institutional spaces. Polysemy was at the core of the Centre Pompidou when it opened in 1977, showing and activating all sorts of contemporary productions. Although it has become this heavy machine, although a lot of complaints I heard about the decreasing surface given to contemporary creations as opposed to the increasing space to blockbusters exhibitions, Pompidou reinvents itself at the margins. One of the notable recent initiatives is the Nouveau Festival. Why I'm saying that with the English accent, the Nouveau Festival. A recurring program led by Bernard Blistern, in which a comfortable area in the museums is dedicated to a vivid festival of current contemporary cultures involving dance, books, music, conferences, performances, and uncommon forms of creation, which usually would not find their way in the institution. The Nouveau Festival is free, and this is worth to notice. It often involves guest curators and artistic collaborators from outside the museum, opening the museum to divergent sensibilities and voices. I'm just showing like 3 examples from Paris. I was asked to do that. The Centre d'Art Contemporain de Bretigny, CAC Bretigny, was created in 1988. Since Pierre Balblanc became the director in 2003, it turned into a center for live creation. It will be live creation. Producing exhibition on site, showing rare artists, commissioning permanent works, and being known in particular for dance and performances. The institution is a stage, a school, a laboratory, an institute, and all of that at once. It is an inspiring platform, constantly renegotiating its relationship with its own space and its community. Le Plateau is starting to make a difference by, among other activities, inviting guest curators to produce a series of exhibitions, not one project, but an entire program. Not only an art center, it is also a FRAC, meaning a regional art collection, which goal is to educate by sharing its collection. Xavier Franceschi, the director, is currently conceiving a new space outside Paris. The artistic direction had been given to an architect, an artist, Xavier Velan, and a scenographer. The intention is to show the FRAC collection together with other collections, public and private, in close relationship with artists. The intention is to renegotiate the status of public collections. The nomination of the new Pompidou's director in December 2013, very soon, will give a strong signal of institutional innovation, or not. The nomination of Nicolas Bourriaud in 2011 as the director of l'École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Fine Art, was a positive sign. But my guess is to see innovation coming in Paris from the privately funded spaces. Cadiste Art Foundation and La Maison Rouge, two private foundations. No picture, please. Two private foundations originated a model with very highly standard programs. The planned opening of two massive corporate art foundations, Fondation Lafayette, led by François Quintin, and Fondation Vuitton, led by Suzanne Paget, as well as not Remorse, because it opened apparently, I'm totally not updated about that, as well as the foundation of Agnès B, will profoundly transform the artistic, economic, and political ecology of the Parisian scene. But eventually, and radical reinventions of institutions mostly done by the artists. From the constantly moving exhibition by John Cage in '95 to the violence made to the museum by Jean-Luc Godard in 2006, forcing its curator to resign, the institution would always show signs of renovation and invigoration with and for the artists. We saw it lately with mid-career artists who, being proposed retrospectives, voted against a demonstrative survey of their works. Instead, they opted for non-linear approaches. They choose for the complex dynamism of a displaced studio. By doing so, they reframe the museum as a space for prototypes, experimentations, and experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. Next is our expert on starlings, Andrew Hunter from the Art Gallery of Ontario.
Thank you. I thought I'd begin by quoting from David Byrne, how did I get here? It's a question I ask myself regularly. I've been at the Art Gallery of Ontario for 6 months. I live in Hamilton, still live in Hamilton. Coming on the train, back and forth, sleep on friends' couches when events like this happen, and I have to get here early or stay late. Very committed to the community that I'm from, of Hamilton. So I asked, the reason I say how did I get here is because a year ago, being at the AGO was not on my radar. It wasn't actually like on my list of career goals and plans. At the time, I was working independently, which I've spent most of my career doing as an artist and a community activist and educator. So independently, but also working on a collaborative project called Dodo Lab with wonderful young artist and architect and designer Lisa Hermer. And the moment, when the idea of me coming to the AGO came up, I was working on two things, one with Lisa in Sudbury and one on my own in Hamilton. Both were working with drop-in centers for street youth. And what I was working on was the idea of working with youth and the idea of art and creative practice as a ways to open up and share their ideas with the wider community about new readings of the city from their experience. So that's where I was, right? And then, of course, I was also traveling, dressed as a bird, visiting people throughout the world, which is something I've always done. So I've come to the Art Gallery of Ontario. I have a much longer title than appears on the screen. I'm actually the Frederick S. Eaton Curator of Canadian Art. And I'm supposed to say that, and I just did. So I'm going to be quick. I'll try to keep very much to the time frame allotted. I just want to show you a few things of what, in the first period, 6 months at the AGO, what I've been kind of experimenting with. And I go back to that question of, like, why am I here? How did I get here? I had an experience many years ago where I went from running an artist run center and being an artist, doing installation work, and being brought into the Art Gallery of Hamilton by Ihor Holubitsky, one of my nod to Ihor, a great mentor. Brought into the Art Gallery of Hamilton largely to work with a collection at a moment of crisis, at a time where there was no money, and asking the same question about 20 years ago, which was, why am I here, and how do I make sense of this place, and what am I going to do, and what is a curator? And so in coming into the AGO, I kind of revisited some of the ideas that sort of got me into the position, got to help me understand what my job would be and how I could work in the institution and what questions I could ask. And back then, I came in as an artist, and I started to work with other artists through interventions to understand the collection and its history. So in my first, among many things, one of the things I've been sort of focusing heavily on has been to collaborate with artists, to open up opportunities for artists for these very what are, at first steps, modest and quick for an institution like the AGO, interventions into the space, some of them very brief, some of them lasting longer, to get very actively involved in connecting with people like Diane, who come in to the Artist in Residence program and are present in the building for an extended period, and engage with these artists to help me understand better what it is I'm there to do and what we can do. So, and I've been very, very lucky in the first 2 months that the two artists in residence in my time, first was Mohamed Bourassa, who was brought in thanks to the funding that is making this happen, and to be engaged with him in trying to understand our Inuit collection, which I'm responsible for, and his desire to work with that collection and to meet the artists. And that sort of was a fascinating moment to be in your first couple of months in a place, where I'm still trying to figure out who I am and why I'm there. And then Diane's presence has, and I'm not just saying it because she's here and said very nice things, has been really profound. So I'm excited about that, the presence of the artists in the institution, not just to have shows, but to actually challenge us to think constantly about who we are and what we are, and to constantly be rethinking how we do things, and to learn from that. And the other thing that I'm really committed to, and even though I said at the start, I live in Hamilton, I'm happy, I'm thrilled to live there. I come back and forth, but I also think it's very, very important for us AGO curators to be out, present in the community, engaged, and being engaged in things like this. So I just want to show you a few quick things. I don't know why I'm looking up, but you can see. So this is one of the first interventions. This happened the second week I was at the AGO. So in my first week, a former student of mine, Casey Hinton, who's with OCAD now, called me. We had dinner, and then we ran over to see the graduating shows of works at OCAD, and I saw the work on the left by Lainey Hinton, who happened to be Casey's sister. And I was quite struck by the work, and I got into a long conversation with Casey and Lane about the collection and how I wanted to engage and deal with the collection. And this work just seemed like an ideal work to bring in the following week on our first Thursday, and just bring a work in very quickly within. I wanted to understand how First Thursday worked and what the possibilities of engaging artists into that very kind of intense kind of program staging at the AGO. So Lane agreed, came in, stalled the piece. The piece was set up in dialogue with a work by Emily Card called Indian Church that you see on the left, and another work by Lauren Harris. And that kind of conversation between works, I've kind of come back to this space repeatedly. It seems like a good spot to keep building a dialogue and a conversation and go. So I have to look up. That's Lane's piece. First, it was at OCAD. Second, here is a week later in the Canadian galleries. It was up for a weekend and then back out. The other thing that I've been focusing heavily on, in addition, and I'll just go through these quickly, is working with a number of cartoonists, graphic novelists. I have a deep interest, and I think a significant part of Canadian cultural production, the work of cartoonists. And so right now, there's an intervention into the salon by the Canadian cartoonist Chester Brown. And the intervention is based on his graphic novel, the comic strip biography of Louis Riel. And so working with Chester, we added into the salon, which is a very specific space with a very specific history about Canada in the 19th century to the earliest 20th century, a strong emphasis on nation building, to disrupt that literally with a rebellious gesture. And so the story of Louis Riel is brought into this narrative through Chester's images. So this is the... Yes, as long as I won't take up too much time. But Louis Riel was a Métis leader, Western Canada, who led two rebellions against the British government in Canada, one in the 1860s and in the 1870s, and the second one in the 1880s. So I have to do a really condensed version of this. But he was tried and convicted of treason and was hung in 1884. And the book that Chester produced tells that story. It's a story that, depending on where you grew up in Canada, you would be very familiar with. If you grew up in Toronto, up until Chester's book, you probably didn't know anything about Louis Riel. So in parts of the country, he's considered a nation builder, a leader, a founding father, if you will, and in other parts is still considered to be a traitor. He's very significant within the French community in Canada, as well as the Catholic community, as well as First Nations communities. So this project is up now. There's myself and Chester in the space when we were originally sort of talking about the intervention, which you can see in the back. But in extension of that is also engaging the wider community of cartoonists. And so Nina Bunjevac in this image, and that's Peter Berkemo, who came in to talk about the significance of Chester's book with the public and also to be recorded in video. I also deal with, as curator of Canadian art, a very vast collection. Am I running? I'm going too long? Okay, I'm going to be fast. So I want to. So I just want to tell you that I deal with a big collection that is 16,000 objects, Canadian art produced in this part of the world from the initial human presence right up to the present day. So two lovely objects. One of my favorite things on the left is an early 19th century Haida carving of an American sea captain, and it's argillite and ivory. And on the right is Pictukin's carving of Queen Elizabeth, and the two of them are here together. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. A couple of the other recent interventions into the space have just installed a work by Merrill McMaster, this work here called Victoria, and it's being installed with Lauren Harris's Dr. Salem Bland. And the two figures, are confronting that same painting by Emily Carr. So the work of art is becoming the trigger for a conversation in the space. I wanted to show this quickly. Diane Brasado did an intervention into the space which we just installed the other day in response to the kind of what has been a fairly static installation of Canadian art. And that's it. So, questions, come up.
Thanks. Next, David Liss.
Thank you very much, Rick. And I suppose in the interest of remaining within my allotted time, I do have something prepared here that I think takes about 7 minutes. And notwithstanding Abbas's proposition earlier this morning about a complete reinvention of a patriarchal colonialist system that museums are today, nevertheless, I have, if you don't mind me saying, a unique position since arriving in Toronto at the end of 2000 to take on the task of inventing an institution literally from scratch of creating a museum of contemporary art here in Toronto. Beginning with no exhibitions on the books, no staff, and aside from an advisory board, no institutional infrastructure, and almost no money. The good news, though, is that I think maybe because I'm an artist, I saw this as a blank canvas and an opportunity to create something that didn't exist. And when thinking about inventing a new institution or tasked to reinvent one, as I was hired to do when I was in Montreal, the first thing to consider is where that institution could possibly fit within the ecology of the local art scene and the wider cultural scene beyond that, being the topic of the day. To me, it should not be a matter of creating and asserting a singular institutional ego, but thinking about what contributions the institution can make or add to the existing conversations and to the overall cultural landscape. But first, I did have to create the institution from scratch by establishing some kind of institutional framework and an artistic vision. But of course, it's the artistic program that is the identity and the interface of the institution, and the purpose of the institution in the first place is to support artistic vision. So the name of the institution, Museum of Contemporary Canadian Art, and the mandate were important, and I made it clear during the job interview that I wasn't interested in a parochial approach of showing Canadian art exclusively, but I am Canadian, and I believe that Canadian artists are creating work on par with artists in any country. But what interests me most about Canadian art is where it fits in and where it can potentially fit into the global cultural discourse and ecology of the 21st century. And at this point, I do know that it's crucial for an artist to be globally connected if they have any chance of a sustainable practice, and they should not have to move away from Toronto or from wherever they live to achieve that. So in writing up our mission statement, I included a local to global aspect to our mandate, which meant including Canadian artists in group exhibitions alongside non-Canadian artists. Also in 2002, I initiated the ongoing Platform Toronto series, focusing on the Toronto art scene, its current state and some of its histories. And in that, around that same time, I started initiating exhibitions and projects that took place in Taiwan, Germany, Italy, Spain, and New York. With very few resources at hand, another crucial aspect of invention was developing partnerships and collaborations with other institutions and organizations. So the cornerstones of invention were a commitment to the local art scene and fostering a spirit of partnership and collaboration, approaches that I saw little evidence of in Toronto at the time. And thus I thought that was a contribution that MoCA could make to the cultural ecology here. And I thought MoCA, another role MoCA could play within the cultural ecology of Toronto was to create an environment that would not only include the voices of Canadian and non-Canadian artists, but also other curators, writers, and even other institutions and organizations through partnership, collaboration, and by programming traveling exhibitions from other institutions. So we partnered on exhibitions, projects, and publications with numerous organizations right across the country and internationally at this point. And by partnership, I don't just mean we program other people's shows. That's not what I mean by that. It's a meaningful partnership. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot. Well, partnership and collaboration is an important aspect of the vision. There's also, well, no doubt that it has a lot to do with combining and strengthening resources. And to some extent, these collaborations have helped us achieve another aspect of our vision, and that is to carry contemporary artistic discourse beyond the confines and paradigms of the art world. This is hugely important to me as an arts professional and as a practicing artist, and personally as well, because I do believe that what artists are thinking, saying, and doing is far too important to be disconnected from other communities and other aspects of our lives. So this has led to a program agenda that focuses on, well, not necessarily exclusively, themes and issues that are relevant to our current condition, that tell the stories of our times, that might resonate with a broad range of the public. I'm interested in the intersection between art and other aspects of our existence more than I am in closed conversations that are sometimes esoteric to the art world. I do recognize the value of those discourses and perpetrate them myself, but as a non-affiliated public institution, I think that our responsibility lies beyond that. And also, given our current location, I would say that about 70% of our audience isn't from the art world. So we've done exhibitions that have critically explored topics such as food, fashion, tattoo art, hockey, cinema, death, life, gender issues, global politics, darkness, light, these kind of themes. But I think within the strategies of inventing or reinventing institutions, I do think it's important to keep in mind that ultimately our goal is to give voice to artists and their ideas. I know that it's sometimes easy to forget that while we're caught up in larger institutional strategies, particularly in a competitive environment like Toronto, that the role of artists can be overlooked in the development of these strategies, fundraising, day-to-day operations, the seduction of new technologies and tools, pressures to develop branding strategies, although certainly the survival and viability of the institution is crucial in order to support art and ideas. But I don't think we should lose sight of what lies at the core of what we do, the essence of the ecology, and that is to connect art to the people that look at it. Institutions, as with individuals, should always exist in a state of reinvention and evolution to avoid stasis and complacency. The conversations and discourse in art and in human experience is always in flux. The challenge as I see it is that in the course of reinventing the institution, we should not lose sight of its core values, that notions of institutional professionalism and the institution itself should not come at the expense of experimentation, risk, unpredictability, an openness to the possibility of failure, or artistic freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Gaëtane.
So hello. I'm in a, how can I say? It's an interesting position in which I find myself because for many years, I would say for maybe the past 15 years, have been working really at the periphery and even on the outside, which is a position that I've always liked because of my cultural background, very much feel like an outsider everywhere where I am. So I like this position of being an outsider in my everyday life and having to negotiate that every time I present myself anywhere in this world, especially in the art world. So I have been at the power plant for a year and 8 months. Not that I'm counting, but it is something that I keep thinking to myself that I'm still standing and still here. And thinking of this notion of a new, renewed model for the power plant, I'm constantly thinking of the mandate of a non-collecting institution. And in doing so, one could not, I don't believe in the reinvention. I think that institutions go through different phases and are very much influenced by the environment and the context in which they are and by the person who's leading the institution. I'm very much from bottom to top, but top to bottom also. So the nature of the personality of the person who leads the institution will have an effect on how the institution positions itself. So to me, in order to look at the power plant and think of a reinvention, the past, the present, and the future are notions things that I think about constantly with every every program or every initiative that we bring forward. And when I think of the future, I'm always thinking of how it is our responsibility as an institution to foster new publics, new audiences. I love audiences. I love public. I want nothing makes me happier than having people in the gallery looking at the artworks, whether they understand everything or nothing. But I feel that it's our role, and in this role I bring forward the notion of our curator of education and her entire staff of gallery attendants. I've given them the task to be in conversation with everyone that walks into the gallery. So as a director, when I peek in the gallery and I see all these individual little conversations happening, I know that this role of the gallery as a connector between the work of the artists and the public is really important. So being a non-collecting art gallery, I really feel that our role is to create milestones for artists, opportunities for artists, because of the size of our organization. We can change our mind rapidly. I can decide, yes, we're doing this, because there's not a high level of bureaucracy, and there's not a high level, not having a collection gives you the ability to move and turn around in a timely fashion. So as David mentioned, for me, it's really important that, being at the core of our mandate is servicing artists and creating opportunities for them to do projects that they would have never done, or things that enable them to go further in their career, and that when they think of their time at the power plant, that in their memory and in the memory of their practice, there's a moment that's important where they felt they were able to do something that they couldn't do. So I start with that in my relationship with artists. So thinking of strategies of exhibition models, in order to create innovation, I think of how to bring new audiences, new visitors, new people to engage with the work of artists and artists. In terms of I segment things, but to me it's one big world. So I think of curators as collaborating with different institutions and different curators in order to bring curators into the discussion of the institution. I think of artists by creating, as you see, I think, what you have in front of you is, so the power plant for our French friends was originally a cold power plant, and so at the center of it there's this large corridor that is commonly called a clear story, because that's where all the coal was housed in it. And so when I arrived, one of the first gestures that we've done is that these walls were 9 feet tall, and we increased them to 24 feet high. And in looking at the history of the institution and talking to people, because when you're new in a city, it's very easy. It's actually ideal because you can ask questions, and people, since they didn't know me, they can be quite honest about their answers. So there was a lot of people were saying there's not enough painting being done at the power plant. It's as if painting is no longer part of the discussion happening in the gallery. So we've created this new space in terms of increasing the wall size. And then our strategy is to create a residency and a commissioning program where we will choose artists and have them come into a residency at the power plant in order to create the new work. But also across from the power plant, which is on the waterfront, there's an island, the Toronto Island, where there's this amazing Gibraltar Point artist residency. So working with Gibraltar Point in order for the artists that come into a project there to go do residency. And so in doing this, there's a link with the gallery, with other artists, and links with the city and the artistic community of Toronto. So our motivation in having to respond to our context as well as to their own context at the power plant in Toronto. So create and become a catalyst for collaboration and networks is something that I think is essential as a role of the power plant. And then lastly, the last thing I want to talk to you about is I strongly believe in, I know for a fact that people even though the art world keeps saying that, people talk about audiences and bringing new people into audiences, it has been known that people who go to museums or who consume culture, quote unquote, are people who have been brought up in that field, right? So they have parents that take them to museum, they have parents that take them to art, so we regenerate ourselves. So how do we, as a community, really, truly engage in a discussion with new people who might not be interested in art? So how do we connect with the other generation? How do we become a catalyst for new people to enter in that? So I don't believe that I'm reinventing anything, but one of the things, we are starting this new program that we'll call Power Youth, because at the Power Plant, everything's about power. So Power Youth seemed like a good title. And it's basically what is not revolutionary in my mind, but might be for the Power Plant, is going outside the gallery and actually going to work with, and this comes from my personal experience. I have children, and they go to this center called St. Albans Boys and Girls Club. So I suddenly thought, why am I looking? There's a community there, and they're totally organized. So we'll work with them, because they're organized, and develop a program with our curator of education, where at the center of that connection is not only that cultural center, community center, and creating a program for youth. And then at the center of that conversation, bringing in an artist that becomes kind of they create a project together. I don't really care what they'll create together. For me, it's getting them to be thinking of art and talking about. And at the end of the day, during the process, I don't know how many weeks our plan is for. Christine, the project is how many months? 18? Oh, so 15 months. So we're doing it on 15 weeks, sorry. 15 weeks, but the idea is during those 15 weeks, the artist is not at the power plant, it's actually with them on their turf. But during those weeks, they come to the power plant, because the power plant is also free. But it's not because something is free that people come. And so the gallery's free, warn people not coming. So the idea is by having this artist being the person that is working with this group and bringing them to the gallery on a few times, that's my hope and my dream, that these people will know their way to the gallery, and if through their experience of being at the gallery they feel welcome, they feel that there's a warm atmosphere, and that they can ask questions and be in the space in connecting to the work of artists, I hope that will be repeated. And if that's the only success or the only milestone that I create at the gallery while I'm there, that's what I'm willing to live with. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaëtane. What's our time? We have 22 minutes for questions. I want to ask one before we get started. Artists and dealers are free agents. They don't have to answer to anyone. Institutions are something else altogether. Institutions are answerable. Are there governance ceilings that limit what institutions are capable of? And I know the answers will be as different as the institutions are different. Vincent, David Roberts Foundation is maybe the smallest of the institutions at this table. Is there anything you cannot do? What limits what you can do?
Money. Well, I think, first of all, we need to say for people who don't know the foundation I'm running, it's a privately funded foundation. So although we are a registered charity, the money is mainly coming from private funding. It means that we don't have any kind of, and it's in London, it means that we don't have any kind of, we don't have to justify about the amount of people coming to see the gallery. In that way, we are capable of hosting a large range of projects in a way that is allow a lot of freedom in the programming. Now, having said so, of course, the limit is always the money. and how we can produce an exhibition and produce an artwork.
So there's no conceptual limit.
There's no conceptual limit.
So
Apart from the director, me.
Okay.
Could be a good, it's a big limit, maybe.
So David Roberts exercises no.
No. I mean, we need to be clear about that. It is not a foundation. I'm not working for a collector. I'm working for a foundation in the way that this foundation is not run by the collector. So the program is entirely decided by me.
Okay. So Toronto institutional people, and any answers from you?
Nope. It's like a game show. He just went first.
Well, I guess in the case of MoCA, as the institution being emerging, there's so many other, battles and challenges on, building an infrastructure and governance and bylaws, this kind of a thing. So as far as programming goes, in my case, no, I haven't experienced any influence, any opposition. Although I do think there are people, let's say, on our board or governance, or people around us, some of our supporters don't entirely maybe understand what it is I'm doing or even buy it. So far, it seems to be working. But again, the institution in our case is there's so many things that need to be done on the government side that programming seems to be engaging audiences at this point. So, no.
First of all, I'd say that I think it's a mistake to think that if you're a dealer or an independent artist, you're not accountable. I think we're all accountable. In institutions, an institution the scale of the AGO, it's multiple and layered and complicated. But I don't think there are limits. We're an art institution, so as long as what we're doing is framed within that way, there are not limits. We have particular relationships with certain donors. We have particular funds that we work with that are very specific. So, for example, in addition to programming, I also acquire, and there are limits to what I can acquire based on the funds that we draw on. So, for example, we have a fund called the Ivy Fund, which is specific to historic Canadian art. So, as much as I like to sometimes, tap into certain resources to acquire certain things, I have to be creative in certain areas because the funds that we have may be specific to certain things, only purchasing Inuit art, only purchasing historic Canadian. But I think having moved back and forth between like trying to work within a large institution and working as an independent out in the world in various ways, I don't find it dramatically different about who being accountable, right? So. I don't know if that directly, but I think it's important.
I always say to my staff that we can pretty much do everything at the power plant, or I hope so. I think that could be famous last words, but when I was interviewed, I was asked to present, the second interview, I was asked to present 8 to 9 projects that I saw fit. So in a sense, I curated that before my arrival to show the diversity of practices that I was interested in. And I always believe that when you apply for a job at a certain level, people better get a sense of who you are before they choose to give you the job, right? So because in the way I carry myself, I've always stated that, I'm not a snob, I like people, I don't care about hierarchy. This is who I am, whether I'm at Bishop's or at Joliette or in Toronto. In going in, this was who I was. So one hopes that people make a choice while fully knowing what they're engaging in, but, people do change their minds also. So I believe in having a balanced programming, and one of the things that at the power plant, there's no programming committee from the board, so which means program is entirely the responsibility of the staff, and so you know, when I arrived, I decided to create a position of curator of education and public programming because I believe that that was an essential part of the work we should be doing. So I think money is a limit like everything else, but I don't think money should be the only reason that one doesn't do things. So then, henceforth, you know, collaborating with other institutions and not being not having the sense that, you know, we need to be the best or that we should be competitive with our colleagues, but rather wanting to participate and wanting to find the time to be part of this symposium, even though really I don't really have the time to do this. But no, but seriously, but saying I will make the time to do it because it's important to be present, you know, as part of a community. And I think we can do that in many ways. So my answer would be, to my knowledge, I don't have so much of that pressure now. Things might change.
Interesting. Barbara, do you want to add?
Well, I work at the Justina M Barnicke Gallery, which is a university-based gallery, and it comes with very particular historical conditions. I don't see historical conditions or the ground that an institution ultimately represents, whether that includes its history, its funding base, its prior audiences, or ongoing audiences, visitors, and so on. I don't ever consider that a limit, but rather really implicitly the challenge of what one ought to do about it, and or what one can do within that. That obviously is informed by the transformation, the kind of questioning and the urgencies that artists also respond to. And at the university, ultimately, sort of material conditions are that one can articulate in some ways the relationship between an academic context and the gallery, which is never certain. In a way, the university gallery always asks, what is a gallery doing in the university? But to me, that's has always been a really great question. One example of how it might work is we've been doing exhibitions at the Jackman Humanities Institute, which are in kind of office meeting spaces, but joining the Jackman Humanities Institute's round of scholars and annual thematic investigations. And one of the highlights of doing that was when the director of the institute noticed or noted to himself and said it publicly that what artists do, that he was shocked to find how much artists do what thinkers think about. And the relationship between the doing and the thinking, I thought, is a really potent kind of condition to think about in itself. And then, of course, the other element is what can a university gallery do to not only serve an academic context, but maybe how does what happens in the university can also have some effect or transport to a public or publics, and with that come, I think, possibilities of research orientation, interest in histories, in local histories, and I think that has been a big part of the trajectory of what I've been doing.
Okay, thank you.